The air over Miller's Creek hung thick with the ghosts of summer, the smell of cut hay turning sour in the humidity, the scent of hot asphalt from the county road. But here, at the edge of the property, another smell dominated. It was the smell of rot and rust, of damp earth turned over and over again. It was the smell of a dog's obsession. Ghost, a German shepherd the color of smoke and shadows, ignored the heat. His paws, broad and dark, were caked in mud. His powerful shoulders worked in a steady rhythm, digging at the collapsed foundation of what was once the smokehouse. He paused only to pant, his long, pink tongue lolling, his intelligent eyes fixed on the ground, as if he could see straight through it. He wasn't playing. This was work. John Elias Thorne watched him from a distance, leaning against the rusted wire of a fence that no longer marked a boundary. The fence was just a memory now. The whole farm was. He ran a hand over his short-cropped hair, the gesture mechanical, a habit forged in the dry heat of places a world away from this green Virginia valley. 20 years in the Army, most of it as a medic, had taught him to observe, to assess a situation before acting. But he couldn't assess this. The dog's behavior was a signal without a clear meaning, a fever with no obvious source. He'd been back for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of living in a rented clapboard house on the edge of town, a place that felt more like a temporary outpost than a home. He had come back to this valley to bury his father a year too late, his final contract overseas having kept him from the funeral. He had come back to take up the reins of the Thorne farm, the 150 acres his great-grandfather had cleared with an axe and 2 mules. He had come back for the quiet, for the rhythm of the seasons, for the comforting weight of a legacy. Instead, he'd been met at the bus station by his younger brother, Mark. Mark, with his too bright smile and his salesman's handshake, had driven him not to the farm, but to the sterile rental. Over lukewarm coffee at a Formica table, he delivered the news with practiced regret. "I had to sell it, John. I had no choice. Dad left things. Messy. Debts you wouldn't believe." The words had landed like stones in the quiet room. John had listened, his face betraying nothing. Mark had produced the paperwork, a thick sheaf of documents with signatures and seals. It all looked official. A developer from Richmond had bought the land. They were planning a subdivision. Heritage Oaks, they were going to call it, a name that tasted like ash in John's mouth. He'd met the town's new lawyer, a young man with a soft handshake who confirmed the sale was ironclad. He'd listened to the whispers in the local diner, the talk of Mark's sudden new truck and the whispers of Old Man Thorne's failing health and finances in his final year. The town had accepted it. It was a shame, they said, but times change. John didn't accept it. Not because he had evidence to the contrary, but because of a feeling, a deep, instinctual discord. It was the same feeling he'd get in the field right before an ambush, the prickling on his skin that said the silence was a lie. His father, a man who loved his land with a devotion that bordered on religion, would not have let it go. He would have sooner sold his own bones. And then there was the dog. Ghost had been their father's dog. When John arrived, he found the shepherd quartered at a local kennel, paid for by Mark. The dog was thin, his coat dull, his spirit seemingly gone. The moment he saw John, a flicker of recognition had sparked in his amber eyes. In the car ride to the rental, the dog had sat in the back, a silent, watchful presence. But the first time John had taken him for a walk along the perimeter of the old farm, something had changed. As they neared the collapsed smokehouse, a heap of fieldstone and blackened timbers from a fire years ago, Ghost had transformed. His ears went up, his tail straightened. He began to whine, a low, urgent sound deep in his chest. He pulled at the leash, his entire body straining toward the rubble. John had let him go, and the dog had begun to dig. For 3 weeks, it had been the same ritual. Every morning, every evening, John would walk the fence line, a silent sentinel grieving a loss he couldn't yet name, and Ghost would dig. He'd tried to call him off, to distract him with a ball, to lead him toward the creek. But the dog's focus was absolute. It was a mission. Today, the heat was a physical presence, pressing down on the valley. John pushed himself off the fence and walked toward the rubble. Ghost. Enough. The dog didn't even twitch an ear in his direction. He was digging with a new frenzy now, dirt flying from between his hind legs. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not of aggression, but of sheer, frustrated effort. John watched the muscles work in the animal's powerful haunches. He'd seen search and rescue dogs work with this kind of single-mindedness. They didn't stop until they found what they were looking for. John knelt beside the growing crater. The smell of damp earth was strong. He put a hand on Ghost's back. The dog's muscles were coiled as tight as springs. "What is it, boy? What do you smell?" Ghost paused, looked up at him, and let out a sharp, commanding bark. It was not a request. It was an order. Then he dipped his head and nudged John's hand with his wet nose, pushing it toward the hole. Something shifted in John's gut. The quiet unease that had been his constant companion for 3 weeks began to sharpen into something else. Suspicion. He looked from the dog's intense gaze to the hole in the ground. The smokehouse had burned down 5 years ago. A lightning strike. His father had never bothered to clear the rubble, just let it sit, a monument to a summer storm. It was just a pile of junk. But Ghost disagreed, and John Thorne, who had trusted trained dogs with his life in places where trusting the wrong thing could get you killed, found himself trusting this one. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans. All right, boy, let's see." He walked back to his truck, the engine ticking as it cooled in the shade of a lone maple. From the bed, he pulled a short-handled shovel and a heavy steel pry bar. The tools felt solid and purposeful in his hands. He walked back to the rubble, Ghost trotting at his heels, whining with anticipation. The first hour was brutal work. The sun beat down on his back. He heaved aside charred timbers, their surfaces still black and flaky. He rolled heavy fieldstones slick with moss out of the way. Sweat stung his eyes. Ghost stayed close, occasionally nudging a piece of wood with his nose or digging at the edges of the hole John was clearing, as if supervising the operation. He uncovered the old foundation, a rectangle of stone and mortar. In the center were the remains of the floor, thick oak planks mostly rotted through. Ghost immediately jumped into the cleared space and began scratching frantically at one specific area near the old brick fire pit. John used the shovel to clear the remaining dirt and debris from the planks. They were soft, spongy with years of rain and decay. He drove the tip of the pry bar into the seam between two boards. He put his weight on it. The wood groaned, then splintered with a wet tearing sound. He pulled up the first plank, then a second. Underneath was not soil, but a dark, empty space. A crawl space. The air that rose from it was cool and musty, the smell of a place that had not seen the light of day for a long, long time. Ghost was practically vibrating now. He stuck his entire head into the opening, sniffing loudly, his tail thumping a frantic rhythm against the remaining floorboards. John knelt, peering into the darkness. It was shallow, no more than 3 feet deep. The ground below was packed earth. He swept his gaze across the space, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then he saw it. In the far corner, partially obscured by a fallen joist, was something that didn't belong. It wasn't rock or wood. It was a shape. A hard, rectangular outline just visible beneath a thin layer of dirt. He took a breath. The air in his lungs felt heavy. He slid into the crawl space, the damp earth cool against his hands and knees. Ghost whined from above, a high, anxious sound. "Easy, boy, I'm here." He crawled to the corner and brushed the dirt away with his hands. His fingers met cold, hard metal. He cleared more soil, his heart beginning to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It was a box, an old military ammunition can, painted olive drab. The kind of thing his father, a veteran of another war, had used to store tools, spare parts, anything he wanted to keep dry and safe. The top of the can was sealed not just with the standard latch, but with a thick, uneven layer of hardened wax that had been poured over the seams. His father had wanted this to stay shut. He had wanted it to stay hidden. John worked his fingers under the edge of the can. It was heavy. He dragged it out from under the joist and pushed it up, out of the crawl space. Ghost immediately began sniffing it, circling the box, his job done. He looked up at John, panting, and for the first time in weeks, the frantic energy was gone from his eyes. He had found it. John climbed out of the hole, his knees stained with mud. He stood for a long moment, looking down at the ammo can. It was just a metal box, but it felt like the answer to a question he hadn't even known how to ask. It felt like the source of the fever. He picked it up. The weight was significant. He carried it back to his truck, Ghost trotting faithfully beside him. He placed it carefully on the passenger seat. As he drove away from the fence line, away from the land that was no longer his, he didn't look back. He just drove, his eyes on the road, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the cold, silent metal of the box. The silence in the truck was absolute, broken only by the soft panting of the dog in the back. The mission, John realized, wasn't over. It had just begun. Back in the sterile quiet of the rental house, John placed the ammo can on the small kitchen table. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Ghost lay on the cool linoleum floor, his head on his paws, watching John's every move. The dog was calm now, a silent observer. His part of the task was complete. John ran his fingers over the hardened wax sealing the lid. It was brittle with age. He took a heavy kitchen knife and carefully worked the tip into the seam, chipping away at the seal. Flakes of dark wax fell onto the table. It was slow, methodical work. His hands were steady. In the field, he'd learned that rushing a delicate procedure was the surest way to lose a patient. He treated the box with the same focused calm. Finally, the last of the wax was gone. He lifted the heavy steel latch. It creaked in protest. He took a deep breath and pulled the lid open. The air that escaped was stale, smelling of old paper and time itself. He looked inside. There were no tools, no spare parts. There were only 3 items, nestled in a bed of what looked like yellowed cheesecloth. The first was a thick, legal-sized envelope made of heavy manila paper. On the front, in his father's familiar, blocky handwriting, was a single word: John. The second was a document, folded into thirds, bound with a faded blue ribbon. It had the heft and feel of an official filing. The third was a smaller, plain white envelope, noticeably thinner than the other. He reached in and took out the manila envelope first. His name on the front seemed to pulse with a life of its own. His hands felt clumsy as he broke the seal and unfolded the pages within. There were several, all covered in his father's script. He sat down at the table and began to read. John, if you are reading this, it means two things. First, that I am gone, and second, that my old dog still has a good nose on him. I hope he's been a good companion for you. I buried this box the day after the smokehouse burned. Seemed like a sign, a good place to hide something in plain sight. No one ever looks in a ruin. I'm writing this because I have a bad feeling in my gut. It's about Mark. I love your brother, you know I do. But he's got a weakness in him. A hunger for the easy way, the quick dollar. He's fallen in with some men from Richmond, developer types. They talk smooth and Mark listens with his mouth open. They've been filling his head with talk of money, of what this land is really worth. They don't see the soil, son. They see lots. They see profit. They've been lending him money. He thinks I don't know. I see the statements he tries to hide. He's in deep. And these men, they aren't the kind to forgive a debt. I fear they'll use it against him. I fear they'll use him to try and take this place from us after I'm gone. This farm is not for them. It was never for Mark, not really. He doesn't have the heart for it. He doesn't understand that you don't own this land. You serve it. You're the one who understands that, John. You always were. Even when you were a boy, you had the patience for it. This land is your birthright. It's your home. John had to stop reading. He closed his eyes, the image of his father's weathered face clear in his mind. He could hear his voice in the written words, the low, steady cadence. He took a breath and continued. Inside this box, you'll find my real will, the only one. It leaves the farm and all its assets to you, clear and simple. I've lodged a copy with a man I trust, an old army buddy of mine, a lawyer named Peterson over in Staunton. Not our local fellow. I don't trust him as far as I can throw him. Mark doesn't know about Peterson. There's also a key in the small envelope. It's for a safe deposit box at the Commonwealth Bank in Charlottesville. Not the one here in town. In that box, you'll find the original deed to the farm, paid in full 30 years ago. There are no debts, John. None. I've made sure of it. The farm has turned a profit, small but steady every year. The ledgers are in that box, too. Any story about debts is a lie spun to cheat you. I'm sorry to leave you with a fight. A man ought to be able to come home to peace. But some things are worth fighting for. Don't let them take this land. It's the heart of our family. It's your heart, whether you know it yet or not. Your father, Elias Thorne. John let the pages fall to the table. The quiet room seemed to hum with the weight of the words. No debts. A lie. The prickling on his skin. The feeling of wrongness. It hadn't been grief or paranoia. It had been the truth, whispering from the ground beneath his feet. He picked up the folded document with the blue ribbon. He untied it carefully. At the top, in stark black print, were the words, Last Will and Testament of Elias Thorne. He scanned the legal language. It was exactly as his father had described. The farm, the equipment, the accounts, everything was left to him. John Elias Thorne, his eldest son. The signature at the bottom was strong and clear. It was witnessed by two names he recognized, Silas Croft and Miguel Rivas, two men who had worked on the farm for as long as he could remember. Finally, he opened the small white envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a single small brass key attached to a simple paper tag. On the tag was a number, 417. He sat back in his chair, the three pieces of his father's legacy laid out before him on the table. The letter, the will, the key. This was not just a box of papers. It was a map. It was a weapon. His medic training took over. Triage, assess the damage, identify the immediate threat, formulate a plan of action. The damage was the fraudulent sale. The threat was the developer's claim. The plan was to gather evidence systematically and quietly. Flying into a rage and confronting Mark would solve nothing. It would only give his opponents time to cover their tracks. First, he needed to see the documents Mark had used. The next morning, John drove to the Millers Creek County Courthouse. It was a small, sleepy brick building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. He asked the clerk, a woman with a kind, tired face, for the public records on the sale of the Thorne property. She looked at him with a flicker of pity. "Of course, Mr. Thorne. Sad business, that. Your father was a good man." She returned with a thick file. John took it to a polished wooden table in the corner. He opened it and found the deed of sale. He found the copy of the will Mark had filed with the court. He took out his phone and took clear, high-resolution photos of every page, paying special attention to the signatures. He drove to a print shop in the next town and made clean copies. Back at his rental, he laid the forged will next to the real one from the box. He studied the signatures of his father, Elias Thorne. To a casual observer, they were identical, but John looked closer. He saw the slight hesitation in the upswing of the T. He saw the pressure on the final E was just a fraction too heavy. His father's real signature was fluid, confident. This one was a careful, deliberate drawing. It was a masterful forgery, but it was a forgery nonetheless. The next step was the safe deposit box. Charlottesville was an hour's drive. The Commonwealth Bank was a large, imposing building of granite and glass. He felt out of place in his worn jeans and boots. He presented the key and his ID. After a series of procedural checks, a bank employee led him into the vault. The air was cold and still. The employee slotted key 417 and his own master key into the lock, turned them, and then left him alone in a small, private viewing room. The box was long and narrow. He opened it. Inside, just as his father's letter had promised, was the original deed to the Thorne farm, dated 1982. Stamped across it in bold red ink were the words, "Paid in full." Beneath it were ledgers, bound in green cloth. He opened one. Page after page of his father's neat handwriting detailed crop yields, equipment maintenance, profits and losses. The last entry, from just a few months before his death, showed the farm accounts solidly in the black. There were no debts, not a single one. But there was something else at the bottom of the box, a sealed envelope addressed to whom it may concern. He opened it. It was a notarized affidavit. In it, his father stated, in clear and unequivocal legal terms, his intention to leave the farm to John. He detailed his concerns about his son Mark, his involvement with the developers, and his fear of undue influence or outright fraud after his passing. He explicitly stated that the will leaving the property to John, a copy of which he described in detail, was his only true and final testament. The document was signed by his father, and below his signature were those of the same two witnesses, Silas Croft and Miguel Rivas. And next to their names was the embossed, gold foil seal of a notary public. John sat in the cold, silent room, the papers spread before him. This was it. This was the proof, the forgery, the motive, the premeditated nature of the crime. But a piece was still missing, the witnesses. A document was one thing, a living person to back it up was another. Finding Miguel Rivas proved to be a dead end. Neighbors said he'd moved back to Mexico to be with his family a few months after Old Man Thorne died. His forwarding address was unknown. That left Silas Croft. Silas had been his father's right-hand man for 40 years. A quiet, wiry man with hands like gnarled oak. John found him living in a small retirement trailer park, a county over. He was sitting on his porch in a rocking chair, staring out at a row of identical trailers. He looked older, smaller than John remembered. John approached slowly. "Silas?" The old man squinted at him. Recognition dawned slowly. John? John Thorne? My God, boy, I heard you were back. I am. John didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled up a plastic lawn chair. I need to ask you about my father, about the will. A shuddered look came over Silas's face. He stopped rocking. That's all done and settled. Mark took care of it. Mark filed a forged will, Silas. I have the real one. The one you witnessed. Silas looked away, his gaze fixed on nothing. I don't know anything about that. Your name is on it, Silas, and on an affidavit my father had notarized. You and Miguel. The old man's shoulders slumped. He let out a long, weary sigh. Your daddy was worried. He knew Mark was in a hole. Those developer fellows, they're not good people, John. After your father passed, one of them paid me a visit. A man in a suit. He advised me that it would be best for my health if I forgot all about any other paperwork I might have signed. He gave me $5,000 in cash. Called it a severance. Told me to enjoy my retirement. They threatened you. They didn't have to, Silas said quietly. I'm 75 years old. My daughter lives just down the road. I got grandkids. A man learns not to go looking for trouble at my age. John sat in silence for a moment, watching the old man. He wasn't angry at him. He was angry at the men who had put the fear in him. My father trusted you, Silas. He trusted you to tell the truth. The truth don't always keep you safe. Maybe not, John said, his voice level. But it's the only thing that's going to save my father's farm. I'm not going to let them take it. I have the proof, but I need you. I need you to stand up and say what you know is true. Silas looked at John's face. He saw the quiet determination there, the same stubborn set of the jaw he'd seen in his father 100 times. He saw a man who wasn't looking for trouble, but who wouldn't back down from it, either. He started rocking again, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Elias was a good man, the best I ever worked for. He wouldn't have wanted his land paved over for a bunch of cookie-cutter houses. He looked at John, his eyes clearer now. What do you need me to do? The final piece was in place. It was time to see his brother. John didn't call first. He drove to the new house Mark had bought on the other side of town, a sprawling new construction that looked out of place among the older, more modest homes. Mark's new truck was in the driveway. Mark answered the door, a surprised, nervous smile flashing across his face. John, what are you doing here? We need to talk, Mark. John walked past him into the house. It was filled with new furniture, a giant television on the wall. It smelled of paint and particle board. John walked to the large dining room table and began to lay out the contents of the box, one by one. He started with the real will, then the bank ledgers, the original deed, the notarized affidavit. He placed them in a neat row on the polished wood. Mark stared at the papers, his face draining of color. Where did you get that? Does it matter? John's voice was quiet, devoid of accusation. It was the voice he used to deliver bad news, calm and factual. There were no debts, Mark. The farm was solvent. Dad's signature on the will you filed is a forgery. Silas Croft is prepared to testify that he witnessed this will and that he was intimidated into staying silent. Mark sank into one of the new dining chairs. He looked small in the oversized room. He stared at his father's handwriting, at the proof of his betrayal laid bare on the table. I didn't have a choice, he whispered. The words were weak, pathetic. I owed them so much money. They were going to ruin me. They came up with the plan. They had a guy. He was an expert. He said no one would ever know. I knew, John said softly. And Dad knew. He knew you'd do it. The words hit Mark harder than a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes filling with tears of self-pity. He always trusted you more. He always thought you were better. He didn't think I was better, John corrected him, his voice still low and measured. He knew I understood the land. He knew I wouldn't sell it for a pile of cash and a new truck. He tried to protect it. He tried to protect it from you. John stood there, looking at his younger brother, a man he barely recognized. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but he pushed it down. Anger was a luxury. What was needed now was a solution. "They're not going to get the farm, Mark," John said. "The sale is going to be voided. It's over." Mark looked up, his face a mask of fear. "They'll come after me. The developers. And the law. Forgery. John, I could go to prison." "Yes, you could," John said, the words hanging in the air. He let the silence stretch, letting the full weight of what Mark had done settle upon him. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for justice. Justice for his father and for the land. He looked at his brother, at the pathetic, frightened man who had sold his own birthright. "Or," John said slowly, "you could help me make it right." The county sheriff, a man named Bill Halstead, had known the Thorne family his whole life. He was a big man, with a slow way of talking that hit a sharp mind. John had called him and asked for a meeting. He didn't say what it was about over the phone. John sat in the Spartan office at the sheriff's department, the evidence laid out on Halstead's desk just as it had been on Mark's table. Ghost waited patiently in the cab of his truck outside. Halstead had listened without interruption, his expression unreadable as John walked him through the story, from the dog's digging to the contents of the safe deposit box. He examined the two wills, holding them up to the light. He read Silas Croft's signed statement, which John had taken to a lawyer in Staunton to have properly recorded. When John was finished, Halstead leaned back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. He steepled his fingers and looked at John. "I'll be honest with you, John. This whole thing with your brother selling the farm so fast, it never sat right with me. Mark never struck me as the type to handle that kind of business on his own. And those developer folks from Richmond, they're a slick bunch, been sniffing around land in this county for a couple of years now." He tapped the forged will with a thick finger. "This is a serious crime. Forgery, fraud, filing a false instrument. And that's just for your brother. The developers for conspiracy, coercion of a witness. This is a big mess." "I know," John said. "What do you want, John?" Halstead asked, his eyes sharp. "You want me to throw the book at your brother? Because I can. And I will." John thought of Mark, sitting in his big, empty house, terrified of the consequences of his own weakness. He thought of his father's letter. "I love your brother. You know I do." His father had wanted to protect the farm, but John didn't believe he would have wanted to see his youngest son destroyed in the process. "My brother is weak, not evil," John said. "He was a tool for these men. I want the land back. I want my father's name cleared of these fabricated debts. I want the developers to face the consequences for what they did to Silas and for what they tried to do to my family." He paused. "As for Mark, I want him to cooperate, fully. I want him to tell you everything he knows about this company, their methods, who he dealt with, who he dealt. If he does that, I'd ask the district attorney to take it into consideration." Halstead nodded slowly. "That's a fair position. More than fair, I'd say." He stood up, his decision made. "All right, John. Let's get a formal statement from you. Then I think it's time I paid a visit to Mark Thorne, and after that I'm going to make a few calls to the state attorney's office. I think they'll be very interested in the business practices of Heritage Oaks Development." The news hit the town of Miller's Creek like a summer thunderstorm. It rolled through the diner, the post office, the feed store. The story had all the elements of local legend: a hidden will, a forged signature, a long-lost son returning to claim his birthright. The quiet, solitary veteran suddenly became the center of a story that everyone wanted to tell. The developers from Richmond tried to fight it. Their high-priced lawyers filed motions and made threats, but the evidence was overwhelming. The two wills, the bank records, the notarized affidavit, and the damning on-the-record testimony of both Silas Croft and a terrified, fully cooperating Mark Thorne. The Richmond papers got wind of the story, and soon the company was facing not just a lawsuit, but a state investigation into predatory land acquisition practices across the Commonwealth. The sale of the Thorne farm was officially declared null and void. The deed was returned to its rightful owner. Mark, in exchange for his testimony, received a suspended sentence and 5 years of probation. He sold his new house and his new truck. The last John heard, he had moved out of state, looking for a fresh start in a place where no one knew his name. John felt no triumph in his brother's exile, only a quiet, hollow sadness for the man he might have been. One cool afternoon in early autumn, John walked the land. The air was crisp, the leaves on the maples turning to fire. Ghost trotted at his side, his gait easy and confident. The survey stakes, hammered into the earth by the developers, were still there, their pink plastic ribbons fluttering in the breeze. They were markers of a future that had almost been stolen. John stopped at the first stake. He bent down, wrapped his hands around the wooden shaft, and pulled. The earth resisted, then gave way with a sucking sound. He tossed the stake aside and moved to the next one. And the next. He worked his way across the main pasture, a methodical, silent harvest. He was not just clearing the land, he was erasing a violation. He worked until the sun began to dip below the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The bed of his truck was filled with the discarded stakes. He stood in the middle of the field, breathing in the smell of the earth, of the dying grass, of home. He had moved into the old farmhouse a week ago. It needed work. The roof leaked, the paint was peeling, and the floors creaked with the memories of generations. But it was solid. The foundation was stone, and the beams were heart pine. It was his. He spent his days making it his own. He repaired the fence lines, cleared the brush from the creek bed, and started the slow, arduous process of bringing the farmhouse back to life. He worked from sunup to sundown, the physical labor a balm for the quiet wounds he still carried. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. This evening he sat on the front porch steps, the wood worn smooth by time. The air grew cool as twilight settled over the valley. The chirping of crickets was the only sound. He looked out over the rolling fields, now his, free and clear. He saw not the work that needed to be done, but the promise of it. The promise of a future planted in the soil of his past. Ghost came and sat beside him, leaning his heavy weight against John's leg. He rested his great head on John's knee and sighed, a deep, contented sound. John looked down at the dog, at the loyal companion who had started it all. The dog who hadn't just smelled something buried in the ground, but had sensed a truth that needed to be unearthed. He had been a guardian, a guide, a silent soldier in a fight no one else knew was happening. John reached down and rested his hand on the dog's broad head, his fingers stroking the soft fur behind his ears. The dog closed his eyes. No words were needed. The bond between them was forged in a shared mission, a quiet understanding that transcended language. The last of the light faded from the sky, and the first stars began to appear. A profound stillness settled over the farm. It was not the empty silence of his rented room, but a living quiet filled with the hum of the earth and the weight of history. It was the weight of home. John Thorne, the soldier, the medic, looked out at the darkness. His mission in those other, faraway lands was over. A new one had just begun, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be.